Moving into a new house is always a bit of an adventure, right? New spaces, new quirks to learn about, and for me, it came with the perfect setup for my work. I'm a graphic designer, which means I spend long hours hunched over a desk, staring at a screen, and tuning out the world around me. The basement seemed like the ideal spot, a quiet, cozy corner where I could focus without distractions. When I moved in, the basement was half finished. Some old furniture, dusty boxes, and an odd assortment of things the previous owner had left behind. I didn't mind. It gave the place character. One of the first things I noticed was this tall, antique mirror propped up against the wall. It was one of those heavy, old-fashioned mirrors with an ornate frame that looked like it had seen better days. The glass was a bit warped, giving reflections a strange, almost funhouse effect if you looked at it from certain angles. I figured I'd eventually get rid of it or move it somewhere else, but for now, it just sat there in the corner of my workspace, leaning against the wall like it owned the place. A few weeks in, I'd settled into a routine. I'd go down to the basement after dinner and work late into the night, chipping away at projects while the house was quiet. It became my zone, and I liked it that way. One night, though, things felt off. I was working on a deadline, and the clock had crept well past midnight. The only sounds were the hum of my computer and the faint creaks of the house settling. I'd become pretty desensitized to those sounds by then. Old houses have a language of their own, and you get used to the random pops and groans. But that night, I started hearing something else. At first, it was just a soft shuffling noise, like someone moving around on the other side of the basement. I looked up from my screen, listening intently, but the sound faded as quickly as it had come. I shrugged it off, figuring it was just the pipes or maybe a breeze slipping through a crack somewhere. But a few minutes later, it was back, this time more distinct. I looked around, peering into the dark corners of the basement. Everything was still. But then I caught sight of something in the mirror. Just a flicker, a brief movement behind me. I turned, expecting to see, I don't know, maybe a mouse or a shadow that had shifted. But there was nothing. Just the empty basement. I looked back at the mirror, and there it was again, something behind me, just out of focus. It was subtle, a dark shape that seemed to hover near the doorway, barely distinguishable. All right, I muttered to myself, trying to shake off the feeling creeping up my spine. I was tired, probably seeing things. I rubbed my eyes, took a deep breath, and tried to focus on my work. But the feeling wouldn't go away. I couldn't help looking up at the mirror every few minutes. Each time, I prepared myself to see that dark shape again. And each time, it seemed to linger a little longer, getting a little closer. A couple of nights later, it happened again. This time, I was so engrossed in my work that I didn't even notice it at first. But then I looked up, and there it was, a figure standing just behind me, close enough that I could almost feel its presence. I whipped around, my heart racing, but the basement was empty, just the same dim light and the faint hum of my computer. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, maybe a reflection bouncing off something. But as I stared back at the mirror, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was there, lurking just out of sight. The next night, I was back at it, determined not to let my imagination get the best of me. I set up my workspace, turned on some music, and settled into my project. But an hour or so in, that uneasy feeling returned. I found myself looking over my shoulder every few minutes, expecting to see something. And then, as I looked up at the mirror, I saw it again, a figure standing directly behind me. This time it was clearer, more defined. It was tall, shadowy, with no distinct features, just a dark outline that seemed to pulse with a strange energy. I didn't move, didn't even breathe. I just sat there, staring at it in the mirror, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It felt like an eternity, but in reality, it was probably only a few seconds. And then, just like that, it was gone. I jumped up, backed away from the mirror. I'd seen it, I knew I'd seen it, but there was nothing there, no sign of anyone or anything. The basement was as quiet and empty as ever. The following day, I decided to move the mirror. I'd had enough of its strange reflections and the unsettling feelings it seemed to stir up. I lifted it, planning to haul it upstairs, maybe even toss it out altogether. But as I moved it, something caught my eye. A faint handprint smudged on the glass, like someone had pressed their palm against it from the other side. I dropped the mirror, nearly tripping over myself as I backed away. The handprint was clear, and it seemed to be pressed into the glass like it was trapped inside. After that night, I couldn't bring myself to set foot in the basement, much less work down there. Just the thought of sitting in that quiet, shadowy room with that mirror looming in the corner made my skin crawl. Instead, I moved my setup to the living room, hauling my laptop, papers, and supplies upstairs. I tried to focus on my work, to just brush off whatever had happened in the basement as some overactive imagination. But in the back of my mind, I kept wondering what I'd really seen, what had left that handprint. Every night, after the house settled into its usual quiet, I found myself staring at the basement door. I tried to convince myself that it was ridiculous, that I was overthinking things, but it didn't matter. Something about that space felt wrong, like it was better left alone. And each time I looked at that closed door, an uneasy feeling would settle over me, as if something was down there, waiting. Days passed like that, each one carrying a strange sense of anticipation. Finally, I realized I couldn't just leave the mirror down there. I had to get rid of it, even if it meant facing whatever feeling had sent me running from the basement in the first place. I knew I'd need help though, so I called my friend Daniel and asked if he'd come over. I didn't go into too many details, just said there was a heavy mirror I wanted gone. When he arrived that evening, I took him down to the basement, doing my best to look casual, though my hands were shaking as I unlocked the door. Stepping inside, the room felt darker, colder than usual. The mirror was still propped against the wall, exactly where I'd left it, but now, in the dim light filtering from the staircase, I could see the faint handprint pressed against the glass, still visible. Daniel walked over and squinted at it. "That's weird. Are you sure it wasn't you?" I just shook my head. I couldn't bring myself to explain everything. "Let's just get it out of here." He shrugged, grabbing one side while I hesitantly took the other, keeping my eyes off the glass as much as possible. I didn't want to risk seeing that dark figure again, even as a reflection. We hauled the mirror up the stairs, its weight seeming heavier with every step. Once we made it outside, we carried it to the curb and left it there under the porch light, its ornate frame looking strangely out of place in the open air. I watched as the garbage truck came the next morning and hauled the mirror away. I felt a strange sense of relief, like a weight had been lifted, but that relief didn't last. Even now, sitting in the living room, working in what should feel like a safe space, I'm still on edge. Keep looking at my reflection in the windows, almost expecting to see that shadowy figure standing right behind me. And some nights, after I've turned off the lights and the house settles into silence, I swear I can hear a faint whisper from the basement. It's quiet, barely more than a murmur, but it's there, echoing up from below, as though the mirror left something behind, something that doesn't want to leave. I was fresh out of real estate school, just starting with the agency, so naturally they sent me out to do a full inspection on this place. You know, one of those learning experiences. The property was a huge old mansion tucked away in a high-end neighborhood. Not exactly the kind of place you'd expect to be abandoned, but it had been on the market for years, collecting dust and rumors. There were stories from former tenants, strange noises, objects disappearing. You know the drill. I didn't believe any of that, of course. To me, it was just a dusty old house. It was one of those houses you only showed to the most curious clients because anyone genuinely interested in moving in would balk at the sheer scale of repairs it needed. It was rundown but fascinating, and I often wondered why no one had taken it on yet. I'd visited a few times before with clients, but this time I was on my own, tasked with doing a full inspection to report back to the agency. We decided to give the listing one last push before considering other options, and I figured I'd make a day of it. I arrived just before noon, planning to cover the place top to bottom. Most of the house was what I'd expected: faded wallpaper in the grand foyer, cobwebs in the corners, rooms that felt drafty no matter how many windows you shut. The tour of the house was going smoothly, at least at first. The main rooms were filled with that musty, old house smell. I took notes, snapped a few pictures, and marveled at some of the old wallpaper, faded but still showing remnants of what must have once been a stylish home. I saved the basement for last, thinking I'd finish up down there and head back to the office to prepare my report. The basement door creaked open, and I flipped on my flashlight, shining it down the stone steps. They looked surprisingly sturdy, given the age of the place. The main basement area was just as I'd expected. Bare cement floors, exposed pipes, a few rusty shelves covered in dust. But as I was about to turn back, something caught my eye. In the far corner, hidden behind some old crates, was another door, partially ajar. That was strange. None of the house records had mentioned a lower level, and I hadn't seen anything about an extra staircase. I stood there for a moment, weighing my options. Part of me wanted to just turn back, write it off as an oddity, and call it a day. But the other part, the part that got me into real estate in the first place, was too intrigued to walk away. All right, I muttered to myself. Guess I'll see what's down there. So I pulled out my flashlight and started down the stairs. The air changed the moment I started down the second set of stairs. It was colder and the walls felt closer, like the basement had gradually shrunk around me. The only light came from my flashlight, illuminating just a few steps ahead. The descent seemed to take longer than it should have. Finally, I reached the bottom, and there, in the center of an otherwise empty room, was a bed. Just a bare, metal-framed bed, right in the middle of the floor. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at it. There were no windows, no furniture, nothing except that bed. It looked strange, completely out of place. I shook off the weird feeling that was creeping up on me. I'd seen abandoned properties with stranger things left behind, so I tried not to overthink it. I turned to head back up the stairs, ready to check this part off my list and move on. But as I reached the first step, I heard something. The unmistakable sound of footsteps above me. Slow, moving across the floor of the main basement. I froze, staring up the stairwell, listening. "Hello?" I called, expecting one of the other agents to answer back. Maybe someone had decided to drop by and help me. But there was no response. Just the sound of those footsteps pacing back and forth until they came to a stop directly above me. That's when the door at the top of the stairs slammed shut, echoing through the small space. My flashlight flickered, and I nearly dropped it. The darkness pressed in around me, and for the first time, I felt a sense of genuine fear creeping in. I told myself not to panic. Maybe the door had closed on its own, a gust of air or something simple. But when I reached the top of the stairs and tried the handle, it wouldn't budge. The door was locked. "Hello?" I shouted, banging on the door. My voice sounded small. I took a shaky breath and tried the handle again, but it was like someone had locked it from the outside. Frustration and a growing sense of dread gnawed at me. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and dialed the agency. My boss picked up, and I tried to keep my voice steady as I explained the situation. "Did anyone else come by the property?" I asked, trying to keep the desperation out of my voice. "No," my boss replied. "It's just you out there today. Is something wrong?" I hesitated, not wanting to sound paranoid. "I heard footsteps," I finally said, looking down the dim stairwell below me, and the door locked behind me. My boss paused. "Hang tight. I'll call someone to come by and check it out." I thanked him and hung up, but the sense of isolation settled in. I was alone, locked in a dark basement with no explanation for the footsteps I'd heard. And then, as if things couldn't get worse, I heard the footsteps again, this time moving away from the door, back toward the main floor of the house. I backed away from the door, pressing my ear against the cold wall, straining to hear. The footsteps grew fainter, finally disappearing altogether. My mind raced through a dozen possibilities. Maybe it was a prank, or maybe a squatter had somehow been living in the basement. I shook my head, trying to clear the unsettling thoughts. This was just an old house, nothing more. Just then, my phone vibrated, breaking the silence. I answered immediately, almost sighing in relief when my boss said the police were on their way. I hung up and tried to steady my breathing, counting down the seconds until I'd be free of this place. A few minutes later, I heard the muffled voices of the officers above. They called out, and I shouted back, my voice echoing up the stairs. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the door opened, flooding the stairwell with light. One of the officers extended a hand, helping me up the stairs. I stumbled out, blinking in the brightness. They checked the basement, but of course they didn't find anyone. No signs of anyone else having been there, no explanation for the footsteps, nothing. One of the officers turned to me. "You're sure you heard someone?" "Absolutely. There were footsteps and the door locked behind me." The officer exchanged a look with his partner. "This house has been on the market for years," he said slowly. "We've had reports before, noises, odd things. Sometimes these old houses attract unexpected visitors." "Like squatters?" I asked, hoping for any logical explanation. "Maybe," he replied. "We'll look into it, but if I were you, I'd be careful down there." They walked me to my car, and as I drove away, I couldn't shake the memory of those footsteps, or the feeling that someone had been there with me. A week later, I got a call from my boss. They'd found out a bit more about the property. Apparently, a homeless man had been staying in the house periodically over the past year. It seemed he had a habit of sneaking into the basement, using the lower levels for shelter. "It must have been him," my boss said, as if that explained everything. But as much as I wanted to believe it, something about the experience didn't sit right. The man they described was old, frail. How could he have locked that door or moved so quietly? To this day, I don't go near that house alone. I've always had an odd feeling about that small, low basement window. It sits almost at ground level facing the backyard, and every time I do laundry, I can't help but look up, expecting to see someone watching. Most days, it's nothing more than a quick look. I tell myself it's just nerves, my imagination getting the best of me. But that window, it's unsettling. Almost as if it's waiting for something. One night, after a long day at school with a pile of papers to grade, I went down to the basement to catch up on laundry. The house was quiet, save for the hum of the dryer in the corner. I was alone. The place had an unusual stillness. I figured everyone in the neighborhood had already gone to bed. It was snowing lightly outside, casting a pale glow through the window, and the light reflected off the fresh layer of snow blanketing the backyard. I was sorting through clothes when I got that familiar prickling feeling. You know the one, the kind that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up as if you're not alone. My back was to the window, and I didn't want to turn around, didn't want to confirm that nagging feeling. But of course, curiosity got the best of me. I told myself it was just paranoia. So I turned, and there it was, a face pressed right up against the glass. Pale, gaunt, almost ghostly, with wide, staring eyes. Whoever it was, they were perfectly still, their face flattened against the glass, so close I could see the fog from their breath clouding the pane. I froze, my mind scrambling to process what I was seeing. A million thoughts flew through my head. Was this some kind of prank? Had someone broken in? But those eyes, they were fixed on me, unblinking, and there was something unsettling in them, something too intense to be a joke. I didn't scream. Instead, I took a slow step back, hoping maybe that if I broke eye contact, they'd disappear. But when I looked again, they hadn't moved. Hadn't even blinked. Just stared. I grabbed my phone and called the police, keeping one eye on that figure in the window. The operator told me to stay calm and that they'd send someone over. Staying calm wasn't exactly easy, but I managed to keep my voice steady as I described what I was seeing. They assured me help was on the way, but the minutes ticked by, painfully slowly. When I finally heard the sound of a car pulling up outside, I ran upstairs, threw open the door, and waved the officers down. I explained what I'd seen, pointing out the basement window. They didn't look surprised, just nodded and asked me to stay inside while they checked around the house. A few minutes later, one of them knocked on the door to tell me they'd found nothing. No footprints in the snow, no sign of anyone having been in the yard. The snow was completely undisturbed, perfect and smooth, as if no one had ever been there. I felt a strange mixture of relief and frustration. Part of me wanted them to find something, some sign that what I'd seen was real. The officer told me it was probably just a trick of the light, or maybe the reflection of something inside the basement. He tried to reassure me, but I could tell he thought I'd imagined it. They left soon after, and I was left alone in the house, feeling more unsettled than ever. That night, I barely slept. Every little creak of the house, every gust of wind outside, made my nerves stand on edge. I kept picturing that face in the window, those wide, staring eyes. In the morning, I convinced myself it was just exhaustion, maybe even the stress from work. But a few nights later, I was back in the basement folding laundry when that feeling returned, the prickling sense that I wasn't alone. I tried to shake it off, focus on the clothes in front of me, but then I caught it. Movement, just out of the corner of my eye. Slowly, I looked up at the window. Nothing. Just darkness. The dim glow from the yard lights painted shadows on the snow. I sighed, relieved, but a little embarrassed. Maybe I was just getting paranoid. But as I turned back to my laundry, something made me look over my shoulder one more time. And that's when I saw it. The face, back again, pressed right against the glass, so close it looked as if it was almost melting into it. This time, there was something different about it, like a faint smirk pulling at the corners of its mouth. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the laundry basket, and bolted up the stairs without looking back. I couldn't bring myself to go down there for days after that. I told a couple of friends about it, but they laughed it off, saying it was probably just a reflection, maybe even my imagination. But I knew what I'd seen, and the memory of that face, so close to the glass, wouldn't leave me. A week later, I finally had to go down to the basement again, and every step felt like I was walking into some sort of trap. I forced myself to keep my head down, focusing on the laundry, refusing to look at the window. But no matter how much I tried, I could feel it, a presence watching me. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I looked up, and there it was, back again. But this time, the face seemed closer, as if it had pushed itself even harder against the glass, almost merging with it. And this time, its eyes weren't just staring, they were moving, following me as I took a step back. I turned and sprinted up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind me. That night, I moved a heavy armchair in front of the door, hoping it would keep whatever it was down there from getting any closer. I decided to set up a camera facing the window, just to prove to myself that I wasn't losing my mind. The next day, I watched the footage, expecting it to show nothing. But instead, around midnight, the camera picked up something, a faint shape moving outside the window. It was hard to see, just a dark blur passing by. But then, for a brief moment, the camera caught a face, pressed against the glass, staring directly into the camera. I haven't been back to that basement since. I don't know what it is or what it wants, but every now and then, when I'm lying in bed, I can almost feel those eyes watching, waiting for me to come back down. Since the police couldn't help with whatever is going on in my home, I'm planning to call a priest, just to bless the place or give me some peace of mind. It might sound like overkill or maybe even silly, but after what I saw, I'm willing to try anything to feel normal here again. I'd just moved into this rental house, and at first, everything seemed perfect. It was small, cozy, and in a quiet neighborhood. The kind of place I'd imagined ever since leaving my last apartment. Working as a daycare teacher means I cherish my downtime, and the thought of a peaceful retreat from the sounds of kids screaming or playing was blissful. This house, with its neat little backyard and the big basement I could use for storage, felt like the ideal escape. The basement, though, I'll admit it gave me pause from the start. It had that unmistakable stale smell that only old basements seem to get. The single light bulb hanging from the ceiling, making everything look eerie. Still, I brushed it off, figuring that most basements were like that. The only issue was, with all the unpacked boxes, I had to go down there a lot, especially in those first few days. The first time I heard the crying, it was faint, almost like it was coming from somewhere outside. I was in the kitchen putting away groceries, and I heard this soft, muffled sound, barely noticeable. It was just enough to make me pause and tilt my head, listening. It sounded like a child crying. It didn't seem like anything to worry about, so I went back to what I was doing, assuming it was just some kid in the neighborhood. But the next day, while I was sorting some stuff in the basement, I heard it again. This time, it was louder. The sound seemed to be coming from somewhere nearby, almost echoing within the walls. I stopped what I was doing, standing still, my ears straining. It wasn't just crying, it was the kind of crying that sounded sad, desperate. I felt this uncomfortable twinge, like I should be doing something, like I was hearing one of the kids at work in distress. I couldn't just ignore it. I made my way up the stairs, opened the basement door, and listened, trying to figure out if it was coming from outside. But as soon as I reached the main floor, the crying stopped. The silence was so complete it was almost jarring. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to neighborhood noises carrying in strange ways. I mean, the basement was probably amplifying sounds or something. Still, it was odd. A few nights later, I was sitting on the couch reading, and the crying started up again. It was late, maybe close to midnight, and this time it was unmistakable. I could hear it so clearly, soft, heartbreaking sobs like a little kid crying somewhere nearby. This time it sounded even closer, almost as if it was coming from the basement door itself. I put my book down, feeling a bit unnerved. My brain started coming up with rational explanations. Maybe there was a house nearby where a kid was crying and the sound was somehow traveling through the walls. But it was so quiet outside I couldn't hear anything else. No voices, no cars, just those small, desperate sobs. I took a deep breath and headed for the basement door. I stood there, pressing my ear against it, listening. The crying was louder, almost like it was just on the other side. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, but it was just a kid, right? Maybe there was an open window down there, and the sound was coming from outside. Slowly, I opened the door and flipped on the basement light, squinting as I looked down the stairs. I could still hear the crying, but it didn't seem to have a clear source. It was almost like the sound was hanging in the air, surrounding me. Taking a shaky breath, I made my way down the stairs, each creak of the wood sounding louder than the last. When I reached the bottom, I looked around, expecting to see someone there. But the basement was empty, the shadows long and thick. The sound seemed to fade as I stood there, as if the child had stopped crying the moment I came down. I waited for a few moments, listening, but there was only silence. With an uneasy feeling settling in my chest, I headed back upstairs, telling myself that I was just tired, hearing things. For the next few days, I tried to push it out of my mind. I went to work, came home, tried to go about my routine as if nothing strange had happened. But I couldn't fully relax. Every time I was in the house, I'd catch myself listening, waiting for the sound of those small, pitiful cries. And sure enough, a week later, the crying returned. This time, I was woken up in the middle of the night, the soft sobs carrying up from the basement like a breeze. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, heart pounding, wondering if I should go check. But it was the middle of the night, and the idea of going down there again, alone in the dark, I couldn't bring myself to do it. By morning, I was frustrated and a bit freaked out. I called my landlord, a gruff older man who'd been friendly enough when I'd first moved in. I asked him if there was any history to the house, any explanation for what I was hearing. He was silent for a moment before letting out a long sigh. "You're not the first to mention it," he said finally. "The last tenants, a young couple, they moved out after a few months. Said they couldn't stand the crying. Kept thinking it was some child locked in the basement. But we checked, and there's nothing there." His words sent a chill through me, and I tried to keep my voice steady. Did they ever figure out what it was?" He hesitated. "They thought it might be something to do with the foundation or acoustics of the place. But who knows? Some folks think old houses hold on to memories." I hung up feeling even more unsettled. Memories? I didn't believe in ghosts or hauntings, but the idea of some residual sound echoing through the basement, it was too strange. That night, I stayed up late, determined to figure out where the crying was coming from. I kept the basement door open, sitting at the top of the stairs, my phone in hand, ready to record if I heard it again. Hours passed, and just as I was starting to think it wouldn't happen, the sound began. Soft, muffled, a child's voice rising up from the darkness. I hit record and listened, terrified. The crying was different this time, more urgent, like the child was in distress. I called out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" The crying stopped, replaced by silence so thick it pressed down on me. I waited, holding my breath, until finally I couldn't stand it. I headed down the stairs, gripping my phone like a lifeline, the light from the screen barely enough to see by. The sobs had been so clear, they couldn't be coming from outside. It was like they were right here, within these walls. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, the crying started up again, softer this time, almost like a whisper. I shined my phone light around the basement, the shadows flickering as I moved, but there was nothing there. Just the faint smell of damp cement and an overwhelming sense of sadness hanging in the air. I was about to head back upstairs when I noticed something. A small, dark patch on one of the walls, right next to the foundation. It looked like water damage, a stain I hadn't seen before. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't water. It was darker, like a shadow or something else. I reached out, fingers brushing against the cold stone, and for a moment I could swear I heard it. A tiny voice whispering, barely audible. My blood ran cold. I stumbled back, heart racing, and practically flew up the stairs. I slammed the basement door shut, backing away, breathing heavily. I didn't sleep at all that night, too shaken to close my eyes. The next day, I started looking for a new place. I didn't care about breaking the lease or the hassle of moving again. I just couldn't stay in that house, not with whatever was down there. Within a week, I was gone. My belongings packed and my mind haunted by that faint whisper. To this day, I can still hear it sometimes, that desperate, pleading cry. I don't know what it was or if anyone else will hear it, but one thing's for sure, I'll never set foot in that basement again. If these basement tales left you double-checking the locks, hit that like button and subscribe for more spine-chilling stories. Got your own creepy basement encounter? Drop it in the comments. I'd love to hear every eerie detail. And remember, next time you head downstairs, maybe leave a light on. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next nightmare.